I stepped out of the cab in Sunnyvale Heights, fighting off the last remnants of Zurich's winter still clinging to my coat like a bad HOA citation. The sun here felt different, brighter, almost mocking, as if the perfect lawns and identical beige houses were laughing at me already. I've been gone for 2 years on those brutal consulting contracts, pushing past every limit, building a life I was proud of. Coming home should have felt like a victory lap. My keys jangled as I approached the front door of the house I'd paid off with my own sweat, but before I could even touch the handle, I heard the music, loud, thumping bass that rattled the windows. Laughter rolled through the walls, spilling out of every open pane. My stomach tightened. Maybe the neighbors had thrown me a welcome-back surprise, I told myself. Maybe the HOA board was actually happy to see me. I pushed open the door and froze. My house was packed. At least 90 residents shoulder to shoulder, red plastic cups in hand, kids darting under buffet, tables piled high with food I hadn't bought. Streamers crisscrossed the living room ceiling in garish HOA-approved colors, beige and navy, of course. Someone had dragged my favorite Persian rug outside for a beer pong tournament on the lawn, right under the no outdoor games without board approval sign Karen loved to wave. My eyes landed on the person who should have explained everything. Karen Mitchell, the HOA president who'd ruled Sunnyvale Heights like a tiny dictator for a decade. She was in my kitchen laughing, stirring a giant pot of stew, acting like this was her personal festival. Right beside her stood her loyal deputy, Mark, playing host, soaking up attention like he owned the covenants. I felt like a trespasser in my own four walls. Before I could speak, a distant neighbor I barely recognized shoved a plate into my hand. "Eat something," she said, turning away before I could answer. The smell of barbecue sauce and cheap coleslaw made my stomach turn, especially since the HOA handbook explicitly banned strong odors from open windows. I slipped through the crowd, each step heavier. No one noticed me. They kept dancing, shouting, posing for group photos in front of my fireplace. My framed Zurich photos have been shoved aside to make room for a homemade "Welcome Back to the Neighborhood, HOA Spirit Forever" banner that didn't even have my name on it. When I finally reached Karen, she turned, eyes glassy with wine and self-importance. "Sarah," she sighed as if I'd interrupted her coronation. "You're back early." I stared at her. "What is all this?" She shrugged, a soft chuckle catching her throat. "A community welcome party. We deserved one. Everyone's missed the neighborhood spirit so much." My jaw clenched. "You didn't even tell me." "Oh, come on," she scoffed, brushing sauce off her apron. The same apron she once fined Mrs. Patel $50 for wearing outside her own garage. "You're always working overseas. We didn't think you'd mind. Besides, this neighborhood should feel like a family home, not some lonely absentee property." I looked around again at people tracking mud through my hallway, at a kid picking at the plants I'd so carefully raised before I left, the same plants Karen had once threatened to fine me over for being too tropical. Mark walked up then, raising a beer to me like I was one of his golf buddies. "Hey, Sarah," he grinned. "Glad you could finally make it. We've been at this since last night." I tried to swallow the acid building in my throat. "Mark, this is my house." "Yeah, we know," he said, dismissing me with a wave. "But you never use it. Don't be so uptight. Relax. It's for the good of the HOA. Something snapped at me right then. Not loud, not public, but quiet like a covenant clause pulled too tight and finally breaking. I set the untouched plate down on the counter. My hands were steady. My voice was calm. "Okay," I said. Just that one word. They barely heard me. The music drowned everything out, and Karen had already turned back to her stew, ignoring the woman who actually owned the very walls around her. In that moment, I realized I didn't belong here the way they wanted. Not really. I was tolerated. An afterthought. A dues-paying ghost. I took one last look around my home, memorizing every stain they'd left behind, every careless footprint on the polished floor. It wasn't just the house they'd disrespected. It was me, and every rule they pretended to uphold while breaking them in my living room. I turned and walked back through the crowd, past neighbors who didn't know my name but knew exactly how many inches my grass had grown while I was gone. No one stopped me. No one asked if I was okay. Outside, I took a deep breath. The air was cooler now, but my mind was crystal clear. They could laugh and celebrate all they wanted. They could treat me like a guest in my own deed. But they had no idea what I was about to do next. I didn't sleep that night. From the guest bedroom, the only space they'd left relatively untouched, I could hear the echo of their voices rolling through my house like a flood of unpaid fines. Music thumped through the walls. Plates clattered. People laughed. It felt like an invasion, but instead of soldiers, it was my own neighborhood family, led by Karen, the woman who once cited me for a political yard sign she didn't like. I lay there staring at the ceiling, a swirl of thoughts crashing through my mind. Every word Karen and Mark had thrown at me replayed on a loop. You're always working. You don't need this house. The neighborhood needs it more. They had taken my hard-earned home, the one place that was supposed to be safe, and twisted it into their playground like I was nothing more than a footnote in the HOA minutes. At sunrise, I got up and walked through the house quietly. The living room was a battlefield of paper plates, empty bottles, and stained tablecloths. Someone had even burned a hole in the arm of my couch. The same couch Karen had once complained was too modern for the community aesthetic. The kitchen smelled like stale beer and grease. Nobody was awake yet. They were all passed out in corners or crashed on my expensive furniture. I stood there in the kitchen, taking it all in, letting my anger settle into something cold and unshakable. I pulled out my phone and started taking photos. Every scratch on the floors, every broken lamp, the hole in the couch, the filthy bathrooms. I documented everything, every insult to my property. This was evidence, not for the police, but for myself, a record of how little they respected the very covenants they weaponized against everyone else. By the time I finished, the sun was properly up, washing the house in a harsh, unforgiving light. It made the damage stand out even more. My heart beat calmly now. I didn't feel rage anymore, only resolve. I went to my room, locked the door, and opened my laptop. There was a realtor I trusted, a woman named Selena, who had helped me buy this place years ago. We hadn't spoken since I left for Zurich, but she'd always said if I ever wanted to sell to call her first. I typed the message carefully. Hi, Selena. I want to list my house immediately. Serious buyers only. No open house. Call me when you're awake. I hit send. I could have screamed at Karen. I could have dragged Mark out by the collar and quoted the HOA handbook back at them, but they'd only twist around, call me dramatic, tell me to calm down, and think of the community. No, I would handle this my way, quietly, legally, and completely. By mid-morning, people started waking up, rubbing sleep from their eyes, complaining about hangovers. I moved through them, polite, distant like a ghost. They barely noticed. In the hallway, I overheard Karen chatting with her inner circle, already planning another party for next month, maybe even bigger. They spoke as though they owned this place, as if my name on the deed meant nothing at all. We'll use Sarah's backyard again. It's the largest, Karen said, laughing. I swallowed hard, letting their words sink in. They really believed this house was theirs, that I would never stand up for myself. They had no idea. Selena called me around noon. Her voice was bright, professional, but with a note of curiosity. Sarah, I didn't expect to hear from you so soon. You're back. Yeah, I answered. I'm back and I want this place sold as fast as possible. She hesitated. Are you sure? The market's good, but the HOA approval process for new buyers can be, I'm sure, I interrupted. I don't care if I lose a bit on the price. Just give me a clean sale. Cash buyers only. Selena promised she'd get right to work. I hung up and looked around the house one last time. The HOA crowd was laughing again, this time about a neighbor who had passed out on the lawn. They had no clue what was coming, and I wasn't going to warn them. I moved through them like I didn't exist, packing up my personal things, my passport, my jewelry, a few framed photos from Zurich, things that mattered. Everything else they could fight over later if they wanted. No more explanations, No more defending myself against their ridiculous rules. This was my house, and I was taking it back the only way they would ever understand, by letting it go. I spent the next 48 hours in a blur of phone calls and emails, moving through the motions as if my life had become a series of automated decisions. My heart was calm, my mind clear. The house was listed. Everything would be different soon. The HOA carried on, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. They went about their business as though nothing had changed. It was almost as if my decision didn't matter to them. Or maybe they simply couldn't comprehend what I was doing. I heard whispers as I passed through the living room, but no one dared approach me. The atmosphere had shifted, and I could feel the tension building, like the quiet before an explosion. I could have left them to wallow in their ignorance, but something about seeing Karen treating my home like her personal community center stirred something deep inside. They still hadn't gotten the message. I wasn't like them. I had always been different, and now I was showing them just how far that difference went. The phone buzzed again. Selena had called with an offer, a good one. The buyer had seen the house once, made a quick assessment, and was willing to pay a price that was even higher than the asking price. I read the message carefully, allowing myself a small smile. $3 million. I never thought I'd get that much for the place, but this buyer was willing to move fast with cash. It was a done deal. I didn't even think about the fact that it would mean watching Karen and her board scramble. I didn't care. I made my choice. This house wasn't just a home. It was a symbol of everything I had put up with. The endless fines for non-compliant holiday lights, the letters demanding I return from Zurich to participate, the way Karen had slandered me in every board meeting as the selfish absentee owner. The paperwork was signed. The deal was set. I was done. When I walked back into the living room to find everyone gathered around the TV, laughing at something on Netflix, I fell out of place like a ghost moving among the living, but completely unseen. They didn't even acknowledge my presence. Mark was sprawled across the couch, surrounded by empty cans and snack wrappers, barely glancing up when I entered. I could feel the weight of their ignorance, but it was no longer my burden. "Hey, Sarah," Mark finally said, his voice dripping with that false warmth he'd always reserved for when he needed something. "You know, this party's been great. Maybe you should stay another night. You could use the time to relax before heading back to your, what was it, corporate job overseas." The tone was mocking, but I wasn't going to engage. I was above this. The little jabs and digs had never truly bothered me before, but now they didn't even register. "I'm leaving," I said simply, turning to gather a few more of my things. Karen appeared at the doorway, just as I was about to pick up a suitcase. She looked me over, her face softening. "Sweetie, I don't understand what's going on. Why don't you just stay for a bit longer?" I turned to face her, her face so full of confusion that I almost felt sorry for her. "Almost. I don't need to stay here," I said. "You've made that pretty clear." She looked hurt, but there was a flicker of annoyance in her eyes, the same look she gave residents who dared to question her fines. "You're just going to leave?" she asked, her voice tight with frustration. "After everything we've done for the community, after all this time?" I didn't flinch. "You did nothing for me." Mark shot up from the couch, suddenly aware of the tension. "Karen, what's the deal with her? What's she talking about?" But I didn't wait for them to understand. There was no point. I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain. I didn't need to. I simply walked out through the front door, leaving them behind. They hadn't even noticed the boxes. Hadn't realized I was already halfway gone. They would find out soon enough. When I got into my car, the weight of the decision settled on my shoulders. This was it. I was done. There was no turning back now. I drove in silence, the city blurring by as I moved farther away from the house. My house that I'd once thought was my home. They wouldn't get it. They couldn't. But that didn't matter anymore. I was reclaiming my life, taking control of my future. It was time for them to face the consequences of their choices. And they would. The sale would go through. The house would be gone. And in the end, they would realize I wasn't the pushover they thought I was. The day of the move-out arrived sooner than anyone expected. It was surreal, watching the new owners roll up in their truck with a big, bright sold sign already planted on the lawn. I stood on the porch, arms crossed, calm and steady, while Karen and the board scrambled around me like panicked ants. They hadn't believed the rumors. Even when Selena had called to schedule the final inspection, they thought I was bluffing. But there was no bluff. It was all real. The buyers were a retired couple who loved the house's style and, more importantly, hated HOAs with a passion. They shook my hand politely, then turned to survey the damage the block party had left behind. I didn't feel embarrassed. Not anymore. That mess wasn't mine to claim. Karen was the first to protest, running down the driveway with a dish towel still in her hand. "Sarah, you can't just sell the house. This is our community home." I looked at her with cool finality. "It was never our community home, Karen. It was mine." Her eyes darted to Mark, searching for support, but he was too busy stuffing boxes with his clothes and half-empty beer bottles. He looked furious, more humiliated than anything. "Sarah, you can't do this," he barked. "Where are we supposed to host the events?" "The covenants say." I shrugged, keeping my voice as even as I could. "That's not my responsibility anymore." He let out a frustrated snarl, but there was no fight left in him. In the backyard, other board members were collecting folding chairs, muttering to each other in disbelief. Some of them shot me dirty looks as if I committed the ultimate HOA sin, but I didn't feel guilty. I felt justified. I walked through the house one last time, with Selena, pointing out the worst of the damage so the buyers could arrange repairs. There was a moment standing in my old bedroom when a tiny flicker of sadness almost cracked through. I had loved this house once. I had built a life here, but that life had been trampled under their feet and their ridiculous rules. Selena caught my eye. "You okay?" she asked softly. I nodded. "Better than I've ever been." We headed back to the living room where Karen had sunk onto the couch, crying as if someone had died. I reminded myself this was the same woman who had ignored my arrival, who had bragged to the neighbors about finally having a proper community gathering, never once thinking I might deserve a place in it. She looked up, eyes rimmed red. "Please, Sarah," she whispered. "We have nowhere else to host. The whole board is counting on this house." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "You made your choices, Karen. I'm making mine." The new owners began moving in that afternoon, their smiles polite but strained as they stepped around Karen's tears and Mark's curses. I signed the last document with a steady hand, shook their hands, and walked outside. On the curb, the board members were still packing their bags, muttering under their breath about betrayal. The same people who had treated me like a stranger in my own home were now seeing what it felt like to lose something they had taken for granted. It wasn't revenge in the dramatic soap opera sense. It was a reckoning. I had drawn a line. I watched them one last time as they loaded the cars. The bickering already starting over who would host the next meeting. That was no longer my problem to solve. This house was no longer my burden to carry. As I pulled away from the curb, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Karen was still standing in the yard, wiping her face with the edge of her sleeve, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Mark slammed the trunk shut, angry and embarrassed. I exhaled, letting the tension leave my shoulders. They would have to find a new place to gather, a new roof to stand under. It wouldn't be mine. It never would be again. And for the first time in years, I felt completely free. I didn't look back. Not once. When the sale finalized, I watched the money land in my account with a quiet sense of triumph. $3 million. I had earned every cent of it, from buying the house on my own to letting it go without warning. 2 days later, I moved into a downtown apartment outside the HOA's reach. The kind of place that felt open and airy with tall glass windows and a view of the skyline that sparkled at night. It wasn't fancy in a showy way, but it was clean, modern, and mine. No one else's memories lived there. No one else's chaos. Unpacking was easy. I only brought what I truly valued. Clothes, books, a handful of keepsakes from Zurich. Everything else was gone, sold, or left behind for the new owners to deal with. It felt like shedding a skin that no longer fit. For the first time in years, I could breathe. I didn't have to tiptoe around anyone's ego or be the good neighbor who folded herself smaller so Karen could feel important. This was my place, my rules. The silence wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. I threw myself into work again, but this time it wasn't an escape. It was a passion. Consulting projects flooded my inbox. Opportunities I'd only dreamed about. People respected me there. They valued my ideas. They paid me well for my expertise, and I gave them my best in return. No more walking on eggshells. No more apologies. Still, sometimes at night, I'd lie on my new couch with a glass of wine and wonder what was happening to the neighborhood I'd left behind. A part of me, no matter how hard I tried to bury it, felt a tug of guilt. They were still my neighbors, after all. I tried to remind myself what they'd done, how they took my home for their parties, laughed at me, treated me like an outsider in my own life while quoting rules at everyone else. They had chosen to disregard me. So I chose myself. Word trickled back to me through old contacts. Karen and the board were struggling. The entire neighborhood clique was scattered. Their temporary emergency meeting locations falling apart, fighting over who would host what. They'd relied on my house for every gathering, every celebration, every sense of control. Without it, they were left with nothing to hold their power together. It was exactly what they deserved. I didn't rejoice in their misery. I just didn't carry it anymore. Their chaos was not my responsibility. I let myself feel sad about it, but only briefly. Then I focused on the future. Some days I'd wake up to the sunrise streaking through those floor-to-ceiling windows, and I'd feel almost weightless. I could choose who to invite in, who to keep out. I could decorate without worrying someone would spill sauce all over my rugs or track mud through the hallways. Freedom tasted good. My best friend Maya came to visit one Saturday. She walked through my new place, eyes wide, a grin spreading across her face. "You did it," she said, hugging me tight. "Yeah," I said, letting myself finally smile without that edge of defensiveness. "I did." She poured us wine, settling in on my new couch. "How's the old neighborhood taking it?" I sighed. "Badly, but that's not my problem anymore." Maya looked at me, gentle but firm. "They'll try to make it your problem. You know that, right?" I nodded. "I know." She raised her glass. "Then here's to boundaries." I laughed, clinking my glass against hers. To boundaries. In that moment, I felt lighter than I had in years. No one could tell me who I was supposed to be. No one could treat me like a placeholder in my own life. I'd taken my power back, and there was no going back. It started with the phone calls. At first, I ignored them. Unknown numbers, or sometimes Karen's name, flashing across the screen. I had nothing left to say, and frankly, I had no energy to listen to excuses or accusations. I let every call ring out. Then came the text messages. Long meandering paragraphs from board members I hadn't spoken to in years. Carefully worded to make me feel like the villain. "How could you do this? Karen is heartbroken. Mark says you've ruined everything." Ruined everything? No, even some of myself. But the guilt campaign was relentless. They pulled in the whole neighborhood, sending message after message about how I had betrayed the community, how neighbors should always come first, how I was too proud to understand what really mattered. It made my stomach clench some nights, reading through the accusations. I would lie awake on my clean, quiet couch, hearing their words echo. Selfish, cold, ungrateful. If I'd been younger or weaker, I might have believed them. I might have given in, apologized, even offered to host one last event to smooth things over. But I wasn't that woman anymore. They had chosen to disrespect me. They had chosen to treat my home like a free-for-all while enforcing every petty rule on everyone else. I had drawn a line, and they had crossed it. My reaction had been measured, fair, and final. Still, their campaign pressed on. One day, I came out of client meeting to find my phone full of voicemails. Some were from Karen, crying, begging me to please fix this, her voice breaking in a way that would have shattered me once upon a time. Others were from Mark, alternating between anger and pathetic, clumsy bargaining. He wanted me to buy them another venue. "You're rich now, aren't you? You can afford it. he'd said, like I owed him something for simply existing as their former neighbor. It was incredible, their sense of entitlement. They had stomped all over my trust, yet expected me to come to their rescue the moment their control was threatened. When I refused to answer them, they showed up in person. One evening, I was coming back from the gym, sweaty and drained, only to find Karen standing outside the lobby of my apartment building, arms folded like a security guard. She tried to follow me in, but I shut her down fast. "You can't be here," I said firmly. "Sarah, you need to talk to the board," she snapped. "We're falling apart. The community is suffering." She was healthy enough to plan a giant party in my house without my permission. I reminded her, voice low. She looked stung, but covered it with a sneer. "You're heartless." "I'm finished," I corrected her. "Finished letting you all use me." Her jaw worked the way it always did when she wanted to argue, but couldn't find a decent point in the handbook. "We're neighbors, Sarah." I met her eyes, calm and steady. "Neighbors don't treat you like a stranger in your own home." She had no comeback. Eventually, she left, muttering something about how I'd regret this. I stood there long after she'd gone, letting the night breeze cool my face. Maybe once I would have felt torn. Maybe I would have caved, telling myself I was overreacting, that the HOA always deserved another chance. But I'd grown stronger in Zurich, grown wiser, and they had never bothered to grow at all. The guilt, heavy as it was, did not break me. I went upstairs, locked my apartment door, and set my phone to silent. It was the only way I could protect my peace. I had to remind myself again and again. They chose this. They chose to disrespect me. They chose to push me out. I wasn't abandoning the neighborhood. They had abandoned me long before I sold the house. In my new life, there was no space for that kind of poison. Let them rage. Let them gossip. Let them twist the story into whatever made them feel better. I was done carrying their shame. Days turned into weeks, and the barrage of guilt finally started to fade. Maybe they'd grown tired of trying to get through to me. Maybe they'd realized there was nothing left to take. Whatever the reason, the silence that followed was as heavy as it was peaceful. But even that quiet didn't last. Through whispers, a neighbor's message here, an old contact's comment there, I learned that the board was unraveling. Losing the house had torn a hole in the fragile fabric they'd always relied on. It had been the gathering place, the shelter, the symbol of their control, the one thing they believed made them the HOA. Without it, they turned on each other like starving wolves. Karen blamed Mark for being too reckless, for letting the party get out of hand, for pushing me too far. Mark blamed her for enabling everyone to disrespect me in the first place. Other board members took sides, drawing lines and throwing insults that had festered for years, but never been spoken aloud until now. What they had once called community was splintering. I should have felt vindicated, I suppose. And part of me did, but there was a sadness that hung over me too, like a thin gray cloud. I had tried for so long to be one of them, to belong, to fit into their world of endless meetings and petty fines. I had given them every chance. They had taken and taken until I finally stopped giving. Now, they were paying the price. Sometimes I'd hear stories of their arguments passed along by distant contacts. I heard about Karen storming out of Mark's garage after he tried to move meetings there. I heard about board members refusing to host them, worried about the drama, following them like a dark stain. They were scattered, powerless in spirit if not in title, clinging to spare rooms where no one wanted them for long. I sat in my new living room one night, lights low, sipping a glass of wine, and let the ache wash over me. There was a strange sense of grief for the community I had always wanted but never truly had. I realized that the house had been a stand-in for connection, a big, empty building stuffed with people who didn't really see me. In destroying their illusion, I had exposed the rot underneath. And once it was in the open, there was no going back. I was free, but freedom had a cost. That cost was knowing I'd never be one of them again. Not in any way that mattered. I got up and went to the window, looking out over the city lights. My reflection stared back at me. A little older, a little harder, but also stronger. There was no regret in my eyes, just a quiet acceptance. They would have to face each other now. Without me to play the scapegoat, they'd have to reckon with who they really were and how they treated the people who paid the dues. Maybe one day they'd change. Maybe one day they'd understand. But it would never be my job to fix them again. I had done my part. I had drawn the line, and no one was crossing it anymore. When I turned away from the window, I glanced at the bare walls of my new place. There were no HOA meeting photos, no hand-me-down rules hanging there. Just space, clean, honest, unclaimed. It was exactly what I needed. Some nights the loneliness still tried to creep in. A memory of Karen's cooking at those forced potlucks, Mark laughing as the self-appointed enforcer, the old block parties before everything turned sour. Those ghosts visited me sometimes. But they couldn't stay because I'd built something new. And no matter what stories they told about me now, no matter how they twisted the narrative, I knew the truth. I had chosen myself. That choice was mine to make, and I wouldn't apologize for it. It had been 2 weeks since I last heard from anyone in the old neighborhood. 2 quiet weeks where my mind could settle and my spirit could breathe. I fell into a new routine. Coffee on my balcony at sunrise, working on projects that challenged me, going to the gym without explaining where I was going, sleeping without worrying about someone knocking on my door with another citation. Then one evening, there was a knock. At first, I ignored it, thinking it might be a neighbor or maybe a delivery, but it came again, a softer, more desperate rhythm that made me pause. I stepped to the peephole, and my breath caught. It was Karen. She stood there small and hunched, shoulders trembling. Her eyes were puffy, her hair undone in a way I'd rarely seen. There was something about seeing her outside my door that punched the air from my lungs. For a moment, I wanted to open it and hug her, to be that compliant neighbor I'd been taught to be. But I stood frozen. She knocked one more time, then lowered her head as if the weight of it was too much to bear. "Sarah," she called through the wood, her voice breaking. "Please, please, honey, let me in." I opened the door, but only partway. She flinched as if she'd expected to see a stranger, not me. "Hi, Karen," I said quietly. Tears spilled down her face instantly. "I had nowhere else to go," she whispered, pressing a shaking hand to her chest. "The board has turned on me. Mark won't even answer my calls. I'm lost." I felt something sharp twist in my chest. Part pity, part resentment, part exhaustion. "Where have you been staying?" I asked. "With a cousin for a bit," she said, voice shaking. "But his wife doesn't want me there anymore. She says I stir up trouble." I raised an eyebrow, but held my tongue. Karen reached forward, trying to push the door open wider, but I held it firm. "I know you're angry," she said, voice thick with grief. "I know I was wrong. I should have respected your home. I should have told Mark to stop." I studied her, searching for any trace of the arrogance she'd worn back then. But it wasn't there. What stood before me was a broken woman, stripped of every shield she had ever hidden behind. "I don't hate you," I finally said, the words tasting strange on my tongue. "But I can't live the way we used to. I can't let you treat me like a stranger in my own life." She nodded, shoulders quivering. I know, Sarah. I was wrong." A sob escaped her, raw and pitiful. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that those tears were for me. Not just for the power she'd lost, but the wounds were still too fresh. He sighed. "I can't let you stay here." "I'm sorry." She looked like I'd slapped her. "Where will I go?" "I don't know," I said, swallowing the ache in my throat. "But I can help you find a place. I can help you get settled somewhere that's yours. But not here. I need to protect my peace." She wiped her eyes, defeated. But there was a flicker of understanding in her expression, like she'd finally seen me for who I really was. Not a doormat, not a background neighbor, a woman who had found her own voice. She nodded slowly. "Will you help me?" "Yes," I said and meant it. "I'll help you, just not at the cost of my own life." I stepped outside with her, closing the door behind me, and took out my phone to look up local rentals. We stood there together, awkward, fragile, but somehow honest in a way we'd never been before. This was not the reunion she had hoped for, but maybe, just maybe, it was the start of something real, something healthier. I would never go back to who I was before, and I wouldn't let her drag me there either, but I could help her as long as she respected the boundary between us. As I searched for listings, Karen leaned against the wall, exhausted. I glanced at her, realizing that despite everything, some part of me would always care. Community was complicated, but I was no longer afraid to protect myself, no matter who stood on the other side of the door.